internet superstar, Destiny. Say my name, say my name. And someone who I'm still waiting on him to propose gay marriage to me, James Lindsay. And our last dude of the day. He is a YouTuber with over 250,000 subscribers. He's the host of Low Society and author of Custom Reality and You. He will debate you so hard, he'll put you in a coffin. It's Peter Coffin!
All right, this panel, we're going to talk about the Great Reset. So get ready. Is it a conspiracy theory, or is this something we should actually be concerned about? Why do we care? In June 2020, 3 months into the pandemic, at a meeting online, Klaus Schwab said this: "The world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our societies, economies, from education and social contracts and working conditions. Every country, from the United States to China, must participate in every industry, from oil and gas and tech, must be transformed." So this is the World Economic Forum. Let me start with their mission statement here. The forum engages in the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. Moral and intellectual integrity is at the heart of everything we do. Our activities are shaped by a unique and institutional culture founded on stakeholder theory, which asserts an organization is accountable to all parts of society. We believe that progress happens by bringing to be together from all walks of life and drive them to influence positive change. Stakeholder theory. When I hear theory, I think, James, tell us what stakeholder theory is.
Okay, so stakeholder is an interesting word. So obviously it kind of means what it sounds like, kind of. A stakeholder is somebody who has a stake in the outcome of something. So if you're a parent of a kid in school, you're a stakeholder in the school's ability to do its education through your children. If you're a child in the school, you're a stakeholder in some sense, although you're a minor in the school and how it's run, etc. That's the basic idea of what a stakeholder is, but stakeholder theory is in fact something a little bit different. Stakeholder theory, which is outlined by Klaus Schwab in his book Stakeholder Capitalism, which I think was his first major book. He outlines this idea that what you actually need to do is adjust capitalism away from a model where shareholders are the primary determinants and the economic factors are the primary determinants of how we're going to organize and do business. And we're going to shift into one where experts are going to be named as the kind of representative stakeholders, say for issues like the climate. So you're going to have climate experts who are going to become stakeholders, who are going to speak on behalf of the world in terms of what the climate does to you, what ExxonMobil does in their business practices. Also, though, it kind of merged in corporate social responsibility and best practices in corporate governance. So what you end up with is what stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder theory is that the economy writ large is best organized by an expert class of people who are appointed to kind of dictate, especially on environmental, social, and governance policy. In terms of what this means in practice, it means that these stakeholders somehow convene, somehow get together through maybe an organization like the World Economic Forum, and they set policies and they set standards for industry so that capitalism can be taken away from the shareholders and put in hands of the stakeholders so that we don't create calamities like catastrophic climate change and so on. So that I tried to give a neutral definition for what they consider the stakeholder theory to be. But in the shortest answer is, it is that technocrats need to decide how we're going to run everything or else we're going to have a calamity.
Lauren, do you also believe this stakeholder theory? Is that a correct definition?
Yeah, it sounds pretty accurate.
Why is this good or bad?
Why is it good or bad?
Why stakeholder theory thinks, okay, I could imagine somebody saying, well, look, capitalism, having a company run completely for the shareholders, you might dump sludge into river. You might you might kind of take advantage of people that don't have a big stake in society. So we have to consider the community.
Yeah, so from the WEF context, which obviously, when we're talking about the Great Reset, we're looking towards their policies and what they're introducing. In 2009, they introduced their own stakeholder proposal, Global Redesign Initiative, GRI, I think. And it's essentially a plutocracy. They are very wealthy people with a lot of capital in nations, companies, corporations, and with this stakeholder theory, they are going to be the ones making the decision for the little people. And this used to be something highly criticized by the left, actually, pre-COVID. You can find Guardian articles about it saying these people are trying to set up a government run by themselves as the stakeholder over poorer people. But it's obviously become just something the right have to criticize now, since the left have given up that as well.
Okay. So, Peter, you're a big power to the people guy. How do you see this? I mean, this is taking advantage. Why isn't this helping the working class?
Well, I actually don't think it's helping the working class. I think it's more or less exactly what they're saying. Like, it's ultimately a representation matters type situation where they pick the people who are going to sort of advocate in their interests in order to make the decisions and all that. I don't really have a lot to say that contradicts what they have to say.
Destiny, any thoughts on stakeholder?
I think we've been told a lot that the United States, a rising tide lifts all boats, and I don't think we really feel that way in the United States. I think the concept of stakeholding is better than the concept of only having shareholders, because I don't think all of us feel invested in the United States when our businesses do well. Or I could be wrong, but I don't think very many people feel good when Elon Musk makes another $20 billion or when Zuckerberg makes another however many billions of dollars. I don't think we all feel like we're invested in the success of American companies. And I hear it's funny because people will explain like, well, stakeholder capitalism is when a very limited number of highly capital-intensive elite people make decisions that impact all of society. I mean, isn't that what we have right now? Like, what's the difference there between like shareholder? Like, I think the concept of a stakeholder is to move some of that burden from only being allegiant to your board of whatever, your shareholders for your company, and trying to have a little bit more of a socially responsible, I guess, way of running your company, which is kind of what we already try to do anyway with like government organizations, right? Like the EPA exists to represent like the public as a stakeholder and how companies function, or other executive branches exist, the FDA, to represent like people's interests in food companies. We have a stake in that.
That's fair. Now, one of the things that advocacy, like the EPA and that actually does have at least some connection to the president and somebody voting, is getting replaced with ESGs. So there's the ESG products. You can have like environmental, social, global scores for corporations. You may, if you don't have a high mark on these, you could be cut out of lending. You could be forced to do whatever ESGs are doing. So do you feel that this is cutting out some of the defenses that you said were there?
I mean, I doubt we would ever implement something like that. I like, people talk about it a lot, but I mean, I brought this up earlier in a panel, like all of Europe will uniformly condemn Russia for their actions, but they won't stop buying their gas. I don't think that any individual country is about to sign. There's a reason why so many of these like global climate accords that everybody gets so mad about end up being non-binding with no enforcement mechanisms. It's because the result of actually enforcing these types of, you call them ESG scores, whatever, would probably be pretty catastrophic to trade for a lot of these companies and a lot of these countries. And at the end of the day, the people that would get hurt the most by that are probably going to be working class or poor people.
But what if all the companies decide to do it? Like, what if the bulk of the companies, if 90% of companies decide to do ESG, it's pretty enforceable?
I mean, then it's going to depend on what the score is rated for, I guess, or what kind of score we're talking about. Like, for instance, like, when we talk about like making healthier food for kids, I know that the Department of Education, I think, had standards for like what your food had to be able to be sold in cafeterias. Like, if people are meeting those types of standards, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. But it's going to come down to the individual regulation we're talking about. Something like climate change is probably going to be a lot more contentious because that's seen as a way more politicized issue than.
What's your guys' take on ESGs?
So we're not talking about policy. No, we're talking about corporate investment strategies. And so the enforcement mechanism isn't necessarily through governments. They sign on. The SEC is now backing, for example, the ESG model for ETFs, for grading securities and other things you might trade, stocks, et cetera. But what we're actually talking about is that the large investment capital firms like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, the largest banks in the world, including the central banks, have decided that ESGs are going to be, if you have a high score, according to what their corporate boards have decided, are sound environmental policy. Again, this is people like, we can name individuals like Bill Gates, Larry Fink. I mean, we can name single individuals, very small numbers of them. They get to set what gives you a high score, and that determines whether or not you get investment capital. That determines whether or not you qualify for loans or startup capital. It will determine whether or not, for example, BlackRock will carry your stock. So all of a sudden, BlackRock, which might have bought up already using other people's money, by the way, which you're the stakeholder, but they're doing it for you. That's how that works. It's your money, but now they have a 20% controlling interest in some company, and they come and they tell the company, well, you need to do this. And the company says, well, piss off. And they're like, well, we won't give you investment capital. Like, we'll find it somewhere else. And they'll say, well, we'll sell our 20% share in your stock and just watch your company tank on the market. We'll sell all of our shares, and we'll destroy your company. And they say, okay, well, we have to play ball. And this is what you see. They also end up being the top. And what happened when Elon Musk tried to buy Twitter, and he bought a 9-point-whatever% share, Vanguard, which is another one of these gigantic banks, bought just enough to become a 9-point-whatever, higher percent share, so that they remain the top shareholder in Twitter, so they could continue to dictate Twitter's policy at the level of the board.
But how do you increase your ESG score?
Well, you increase your ESG score by doing whatever these central bankers decide constitutes sound environmental policy. For example, when COVID-19 was a big problem, they decided that there was an environmental hazard with the virus. It was best mitigated by wearing large numbers of disposable paper masks, for example, surgical masks. And so your ESG score, your environmental score, might have gone up, despite the fact that there's 160 billion masks floating in the ocean now, which normally we would think is an ecological catastrophe. So they get to decide. Maybe it's that they're going to cramp the fossil fuel industries, which they have been doing for a very long time, making it much more expensive to do that. Maybe it's that they're going to subsidize green energy, which they've been doing for a very long time. Maybe it's they're going to decide, as they just did when the conflict in Ukraine broke out, that all of a sudden you can raise your social score under ESG, that's the S, by investing, by being somebody like, Northrop Grumman or something like that, and building weapons to send to Ukraine. So all of a sudden, weapons manufacturers and the military-industrial complex become a social good under the new global social order that they're looking at. So now we're doing their policy. So it's ultimately whatever they decide. Mostly the S is not this weird Ukraine weapons thing. It's mostly, did you implement social justice policies? Did you implement a DEI office? Do you have a DEI officer or a cadre of DEI officers who are going to enforce DEI within your company, both in terms of hiring those people and having the policies? And then for your G score, you might raise your governance score by, again, hiring consultants that these people tell you. ESG officers right now make about $1 million a pop. It's a 7-figure job to be a corporate ESG officer, and every big corporation, if they want a good G score, has to hire one. So what you can see is that this works like a cartel. This works like a racket, using investment capital as the tools. We're not talking about EPA policy at this point. We're now talking about a small number of people, maybe 50 in total, deciding what the best environmental policy is, Bill Gates among them, what the best social policy is, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their educational initiatives being among them, and then whatever else was his governance, deciding that's how your score goes up. And it determines not whether you're it's not the government checking you on this. It's corporations and mostly banks offering you whether or not they're going to play with your capital. So it's a totally different mechanism. It is fascism is the name for this, and I think we can get some strong agreement that this is the model of fascism. And in fact, they call it a public-private partnership, so they don't have to call it fascism, because people would probably be alarmed if they called it fascism directly.
Okay, so none of this has anything to do with fascism. I don't know why the word is invoked. Also, I think that this entire conversation betrays like a huge misunderstanding of the efficiency of capital markets in the United States and across the world.
Can I break up for 1 second? How many of Klaus Schwab's books have you read? Because I read all of them.
Absolutely none of them. Give me a definition of fascism that would be incorporated in this.
It's the fusion of public and private.
That has nothing to do with fascism.
It is the corporatism of it is the corporatism of Benito Mussolini, where he said that he brings the corporation into the state. It is a fusion of corporate and state power, or in modern parlance, a public-private partnership.
Well, that's the case, then we've been in a fascist state for a long time.
That means literally every single government and everything in the world is fascist. This is not what fascism is. I guess it's a fun word to use. People on the left like to use it, so maybe people on the right are using it too. So second thing, the idea that like some select group of people are going to be controlling their investment firms and then directing their investment firms against the interests of the shareholders of those investment firms to financially ruin companies or degrade them in order to meet some social paradigm, to where they're trying to increase their scores or whatever. If that was the case, there would be so much other external capital flowing into these industries if these companies were truly being ruined by people trying to raise some arbitrary social media score. I don't think that capital markets in the United States at 17 different levels would allow a few people to make decisions to ruin the way that a company performs.
You do realize that these companies control $20 trillion in assets.
Yeah, but
right?
they control $20 trillion in assets because they represent shareholder interests. If these companies were to begin to function in a way to where they were ruining companies, people would. There's tons of capital out there.
No. Unfortunately, when you sign up for an index fund, you typically also sign away your vote. You're giving them the power to vote for you by proxy.
Yeah, but what do you buy index funds based on? You buy them on past performance. If I start to see that BlackRock or Vanguard is offering me ETFs that are never being competitive with other ETFs marketed by people that don't do this weird GSE stuff, I'm not going to buy from Vanguard, right? These guys live and die based on the performance of their funds. The idea that they're going to arbitrarily tank companies because they want to, win wars on Twitter or because they want to increase some arbitrary score.
They don't want to win wars on Twitter. They want to own the world.
They already own the world. There are already a select few people that have a high level of capital investment.
Then
We're not changing anything.
Why can't they do that then?
Because people aren't going to invest in their companies. If
so they don't own the world, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that they already have a high amount of capital, but people aren't going to invest in funds that are underperforming other funds just because they're trying to win some.
If they hold control over $20 trillion, there's $40 trillion in the world total. They have half of that. I think that's enough to dictate pretty much any of that.
What is this term?
I'm glad we all agree that there's a few select elites that rule the world and they're dictating our future. So I think we can end the debate here. I appreciate
there's a reason why. There's a reason why they have this much capital to use, and it's because they generally perform well based on other investors in the market. People don't buy. It's not like Vanguard forces you to buy their ETFs. It's not like BlackRock or other people are forcing you to be investors in these institutional
companies. It's not
companies.
a consumer market though. They're not going to the Better Business Bureau and look at how many stars that the hedge fund
but
has.
when you buy, does anybody here own any stocks or investment funds? Does anybody here buy funds? You could look at the historical performance of any of these index funds or any of these ETFs or whatever. If you've got one that's underperforming, people just aren't going to buy it. There's going to be so much money flowing into these types of investment opportunities.
You don't think the concentration of capital, which yes does imply past success. You don't think that doesn't give them an advantage, though, in terms of where they are positionally?
It could give them an advantage, but when they start acting in a way that is betraying the interests of the shareholders of these companies, I think you would see, accordingly, capital start to flow towards other investment firms.
But, the stakeholder model suggests that your shareholders aren't primal.
Yeah.
Right? So you could get away with saying, hey, this is the new way we're doing things, so you've got to accept a lower return.
And then people sell your fund. Socially responsible investing has always been a meme that people, you can go to you can call your investment guy. It's I want to invest in something social, and they'll give you we'll go buy 10 shares of this green energy company or whatever. This has always been a thing that's existed in investment markets. But the idea that they would start to return worse performances over time for their funds, and everybody would just accept it, at that point, that means everybody's bought into the concept anyway. But I just don't see anybody managing their portfolio being I could buy SPY, I could buy VO, but I'm going to buy this other fund that only has a 4% year-over-year return, but it's because they're socially responsible. I don't see a lot of people doing that with their 401ks.
I believe there are a lot of things you don't see.
There's nothing to respond to. I think the issue is that I think a lot of people just don't understand anything about investing, anything about finance, anything about how these companies work. This idea that there are 50 people that can work in contrary to so much money in the market, it shows a childlike understanding of how these markets work. That you think that one guy can walk in front of investors that might represent trillions of dollars of funds and go, well, today we're going to sink Exxon because we think a greener policy makes for a brighter tomorrow. Everybody would be okay, cool, good luck, and then they would take their money and leave. Anybody has the ability to do that right now. All of us can make Robinhood accounts. Everybody can make a Charles Schwab account. Everybody can make a Vanguard account and choose what funds you want to buy. Unless somebody is forcing you to invest in a particular fund, you just don't understand how capital markets work in the United States.
You never understand. It's not just you, because I'm having a flashback to my conversation with Jangles at the last one of these things. Incentives exist, right? These people have created these incentives throughout by building up these ETF portfolios that they've had. BlackRock did not have $20 trillion of assets at its fingertips 10 years ago. It's built up to that. It has increasingly gathered market share, and it is as it has increasingly gathered market share, or control of market share, I should say, as it's done that, it's increasingly also placed leverage on individual corporations. Again, we're not talking about consumers. We're not even talking about individual buyers of stocks. We're literally talking about the vast majority, and we have a Marxist on the panel, so he's going to appreciate this quite a lot. The vast majority of corporate stocks are not owned by individuals. They are owned by other companies.
Correct.
That's right. And they are actually owned by other companies. And the two companies that own, first of all, each other, and second of all, virtually controlling stakes in almost every major corporation in the top 1,000 corporations of the world happen to be BlackRock and Vanguard, which means these two corporate boards, which probably total fewer than 20 people, honestly, although nobody knows who's on Vanguard's board, which is super shadowy and weird. We know that BlackRock is headed by Larry Fink. These two corporate boards control a unbelievable amount of influence. And so when they cook up a scheme and they say, well, look, we're going to shift to this new stakeholder theory, and under stakeholder theory, we're going to stop fooling around with short-term shareholder profitability. Oh yeah, you can have a bang year this year, and then everything's going to go to crap 5 years from now. Now we want to look, they come in and they sell you this snake oil that we're going to look at long-term profitability instead of short-term profitability. Start this 10 years ago. We're just now seeing, Elon Musk has just tweeted out like today that ESG doesn't make any sense. We're seeing the challenge against Disney, which is their social score has been great. We're starting to see these cracks in this dam, but this thing has been building up for 10 years, and very, very few people were talking about it. And since we're talking about the Great Reset is central to the idea that we're going to now reorganize the economy around this model, because these people who have this model of environmental, social, and governance sensibility are going to be able to better dictate what long-term sustainability and resilience, primarily, not even profitability for corporations, is going to look like. But we have a name for that, which is central planning. It's just a reinvention of central planning, but now you no longer have governments or even anybody who's accountable to people. You have a very small number of corporate managers who have seized that planning role for themselves through these mechanisms.
What does central planning mean to you when you say that?
What did you say? I'm sorry.
What does central planning mean to you?
Central planning is when you plan the economy from within a centralized location, like a single government or single boardroom or a couple set of boardrooms that are working in concert with one another.
Okay, no. So central planning is the idea of planning an economy independent of market inputs or outputs, so the performance of companies. The idea that a large...
ESG will sink your freaking company,
yes,
but you're being forced to participate in it through coercion, not through literal force.
But the problem is that when you talk about Vanguard or you talk about BlackRock being these massive institutional investors, it's not just 20 people that are making these decisions. It's 20 people that are representing the shareholders of that company. That's how they have that money. That's how they get that capital. It's from people buying into their investment funds. And if they were to start tanking some of the companies that they're, I guess, investing in because of the ESG scores, that money is going to shift. Capital markets are some of the most liquid, efficient markets across the entire world. There's no way that you can just pull the wool over everybody's eyes and say, well, this is happening and there's nothing you can do about it. That money will flow to other places incredibly quickly.
I don't know how old you were, Stephen, in 2008 when we figured out that they pulled the wool over literally everybody's eyes about mortgage-backed securities, which is literally exactly the same problem, but maybe you don't remember that. But I want to point out, in fact, where did this term Great Reset come from? It didn't come from Klaus Schwab, even though he wrote a book right after the pandemic began, oddly in June of 2020, COVID-19, The Great Reset, is the title of a book in June of 2020, which is really fast. We're going to change the whole world based on COVID. 2 months after it came out, we now know we have to change the whole world. It's a little weird, but the actual word, The Great Reset, was in a book by Richard Florida from 2010 called The Great Reset. Turns out Klaus wasn't that creative, and he maybe plagiarized that idea. And Richard Florida looked at what happened when these mortgage-backed securities collapsed, and he was like, well, we've got to completely reorganize the economy, and we have to completely reorganize what we think in terms of living spaces. We have to have these new cities. We need to concentrate people into smaller locations, et cetera. He had a whole roadmap for what a sustainable and resilient housing market, but also world in which that housing market is embedded, is placed. And we have to have a great reset of the economy. Then all of a sudden, you start having this shift through what used to be corporate responsibility, social responsibility, environmental responsibility, and all of a sudden you start having a very small number of very high-level elites start dictating in the banking industry, which got bailed out on ridiculous, maybe $30 trillion of assets, which they lied to the public and told us it was far less than that, and started to build this thing that exactly by which you fleece the entire population into, oh, these banks are the good guys now. They actually are, look how responsible they are. They're doing all this woke stuff. They care about gays and lesbians. They're obviously the good guys. They have a gay flag flying outside of Goldman Sachs now, so they're obviously not doing anything evil at all. And, literally, this is how they did this. They convinced people that they had the right side of all of these social and environmental issues. And I find it really funny that, literally here I am arguing with a leftist about centralized power and the corruption of markets. That you can't see that literally the Occupy Wall Street movement was the first thing they crushed when they started to forge this unholy alliance between the big banks and the big government.
There's like nothing for me to even tackle in terms of what you're saying, because you're saying nothing.
What?
Like the idea that 2008 happened because of
banking misfeasance. That's why it happened. The bankers doing crappy things and tricking people into thinking they were not crappy things. And then that catching up to us in a catastrophic way is exactly what we're now living through, and they're calling it the Great Reset, which reminds me of the Great Leap Forward.
The whole issue behind 2008 was an example of misaligned incentives. That was the issue. All of those markets were functioning exactly as they should. People should have been buying houses. People should have been taking crazy loans. The housing market was constantly increasing. If you look at the cost of houses, even if you couldn't afford a loan, it doesn't matter, because you double your equity in your house like a year later because of all the rising costs. Banks were incentivized to sell the loans because they could package it up and sell it to investment banks. Investment banks were incentivized to do it because Fed rates were low. And worldwide, everybody's looking for stuff to invest in. None of this points to like one individual bad actor. As much as you guys like to point to like 20 people in a room that are ruining everything, the reality is that sometimes market incentives can be misaligned. And this might be a place where people can step in and go, hey, maybe there are places where representing the broader society, maybe we can make some decisions about how these markets should function, rather than pretending it's some huge conspiracy that a few people can throw away trillions of dollars of capital because they want a company to hire more gay black people or something.
It's not 20 individual bad actors. It's not the World Economic Forum itself that are planning this all. And I think that's a problem of the right and how they've presented the Great Reset and that conversation. If you actually look at Klaus Schwab's book, a lot of what he's talking about in the Great Reset is things that are already moving forward in countries and corporations, policies already in place that they want to promote and excel, and they want to work with governments to excel that, what they can invest in, conferences they can start, things they can lobby and influence. So it's not just these shadowy figures behind the World Economic Forum pulling every string. It's a shift that they're going to use COVID and the pandemic to push forward even quicker.
Yeah, but a lot of these ideas are marketable. So even before, or maybe you think this is all Great Reset people, I don't know. One thing that companies learned over the past 10 or 15 years is that if you sell your packaging is environmentally friendly, you say that your beans come from highly paid workers or whatever, as dumb as this might seem to some people, these are effective marketing strategies where even selling a higher cost of your final good or service can actually have people coming into your store to buy stuff. Yeah, so the question is are there really a shadowy group of people that are leading the change, or are customers just a little bit more environmentally conscientious and they want to buy, they'll pay a little bit more if they can feel better about buying some green, carton of milk.
That's a good example you can find that's on your side, but there's plenty of bad examples that aren't good for certainly small companies and the people as well. You look at what's going on in the UK right now. They are directly using the pandemic as an excuse to shut down a lot of small farms, saying, you can't have chickens outside. No more free-range chickens. They're banning that right now in the UK, and you have to follow extremely high biometric policies that just the average small farm can't afford, which is obviously helping big business, reducing the amount of free-range eggs, which generally people want, but they're all doing it under the guise of disease. We want to stop disease, and that's an instant market shift, power to larger corporations that can afford to make these changes. Smaller companies, even household chickens, can't own them anymore.
I mean, that's going to be the case. If you have problems with capitalism or corporations,
that's not capitalism.
It is always going to be the case that larger
I
firms.
think it's capitalism.
It's always going
capitalism
to be,
for the government to come in and tell you can't own chickens anymore.
It's going to be capitalism
I think the state works in the capital interest. Yeah.
Any restriction that you place is always going to be met easier by larger corporations. That's the nature of the economy of scale. That's what happens when firms grow in size. That's why every time there's any government incentive program, any government regulation or restriction, people will always point out, well, hey, this is more harmful to big businesses than larger businesses. Yeah, of course, because larger businesses can always function better in any environment with any regulation because they're able to meet and exceed those standards.
So I'm glad we agree that the government are shifting a bunch of power to large corporations.
Well, but the problem is no, it's a natural shift that will happen.
Yeah, it's a natural shift that the World Economic Forum and a lot of lobbyists are promoting.
Right, and by the way, you should go to the World Economic Forum website and look up their list of partners. It's literally most of the 1,000 largest corporations in the world are their
Yeah.
list of committed partners. And if you watch any of the World Economic Forum, meetings, they start out with basically what's like a commitment to our forward-looking vision, where they all, it's very ritualistic looking in a kind of weirdly corporate sense, where they're saying we all commit to creating this better world. And I'm telling you, like literally most of the 1,000 largest corporations in the world have signed on to this program. Where Klaus is saying, as Lauren rightly pointed out, Klaus is saying there are these changes coming through the world, the rapidity, the velocity, blah, 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 the complexity. And so what we need, the whole narrative, and his newest book is called The Great Narrative, as a matter of fact.
He's so honest. I appreciate it.
He really is. So the whole point is that the world's changing very rapidly. There are all these diseases we've got to be scared of. There's the possibilities of synthetic biology that we have to be scared of. Things are changing so quickly because of AI and because of technology and social media, et cetera, that what we need is a group of people to cooperate to usher us through this. And who needs to lead that is the relevant experts leading one way or another by bringing together government, foundation, and corporation in order to work in a kind of harmonized way that he's calling a public-private partnership. His goal, he explicitly says, is to break out of the existing model and into what he calls a circular economy, which is a completely different thing. Now, as far as the capitalist point goes, as the resident anti-Marxist, I will say that, yes, this is capitalism. I agree with the Marxist. But that's because, and this is where my friend, and I mean that, Peter and I will disagree. I think that Marx caricatured capitalism, and in fact, it's his coinage, it's his word, capitalism. He caricatured what a free market economy is. And so, to the point, it is capitalism as Marx laid it out. It is not a free market. It is a highly captured market.
I don't think it's a free market.
It's certainly not a free market.
I just wanted to put some color on this. So it's not just the WEF, but Business Roundtable just a couple years ago, which is signed by a conglomeration of 178 of the world's biggest CEOs, changed from a shareholder-based primacy. So they've had this since 1978. So since 1997, they've always endorsed shareholder primacy. Now they're saying stakeholder primacy. So you're kind of arguing on free market principles and stockholder principles, but this is stakeholder. What happens when all the banks won't lend to you because now you're a sin stock because your ESG score isn't good enough? Is that a free market? I mean,
if there is money to be made, you will be able to raise funds to do it. Unless we're talking about some like government crackdown on loans or some crazy authoritarian reach into banks that doesn't allow you to like lend money to people, if there is money to be made.
But that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, but we're always talking about this, and it's never happened.
Instead, we're pointing to like we're pointing the three principles on the WEF website. It's literally about formalizing a public-private partnership.
And I'm sure Starbucks says they love all their employees and treat them with love and respect.
So what you're saying is the WEF lies?
What I'm saying is if you talk to a bunch of billionaires, of course they're always going to be talking about how to create and shape a better tomorrow and future. Of course that's what they're going to be talking about. But the question is it actually happening in a way that's detrimental to what we see in society? Like, are there actually examples of like, this company used to be really good and now because of the pursuit of ESG scores, now they've tanked completely, but we're all forced to buy the stock anyway.
Disney.
Well, we've had
$45 billion down.
Disney, the largest company that like owns like 80% of new films coming out, is your go-to example for a failing company?
We'll see how that goes, won't we? The missile just hit them last week. What are you talking about?
So
it's like the Titanic took hours to sink, man.
I want to get a commitment here. So you're telling me what you think in 5 or 10 years you think Disney's going to be gone or out of business? You really believe that?
I don't know. That's why I said we will see.
This is like the standard. I hate pundits that do this. You guys will make these huge predictions. You know
but
it's
most
ridiculous.
Pundits also haven't read literally all of the fucking books.
And yet, even though you've read them all, you won't give me a prediction, right? Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. You're engaging in the same behavior that you criticize these people for when you talk about like, oh, well, they're saying there's all these diseases that are going to kill us, and now you're here saying like, well, I think Disney's going to go out of business. Really, you don't believe that?
No,
you're just saying it because
Disney
it sounds
lost $45 billion in value in 2 weeks as a result of their S-score raising social policy that they blurted out online. That's what I'm saying, that they took a $45 billion hit over their stupid ESG compliant policy. That's all I said. I'm not talking about if they're going to go out of business. I hope they go out of business. I hope they burn.
Look at Facebook stock after they went after Meta. What? This is probably over, what, like $100 billion in change in terms of like that stock tanking? I mean, like,
when you
it
start
happens.
talking about
Companies-
like shareholders and stuff, so Elon just offered like a 40% premium on the value of Twitter's stock, and it went real weird real fast. So you start talking about like shareholders. We're to the point now where we're about to see a massive fiduciary responsibility lawsuit that's going to make or break how this goes going forward. So you're asking me to answer questions that cannot be answered because the door literally just opened. But if the door had not been opened, I can tell you exactly how they would go, is that we would continue to march into this sweet, sweet good night that looks exactly like the Chinese captured market system. That's exactly where this is headed. That's exactly what the point of the Great Reset is to turn the West into a copycat of China. How do I know that? They actually say it. I'm not making it up. They say that the goal is that if we want to compete with China, we have to become like China. We have to gain this extra control over our markets and put this authoritarian control in our markets because otherwise everything's too slow, blah, 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 blah. They say it.
Yeah, but it's absorbing the state into the corporate sector, not absorbing the corporate sector into
Correct.
the state.
It's the opposite. And so you're a dialectical thinker, so you'll appreciate that it's a dialectical inversion, right? It's not communism absorbing a fascist-style corporate model. It's instead a fascist-style corporate model absorbing communist principles under a mockery of them, I will say for you, under auspices of things like DEI, which, as we talked earlier, they mimic
with DEI. It's a different thing altogether.
But it does have a redistribution scheme under the term equity. Okay, so it's like we might agree through the postmodern literature to call it a simulation or a simulacrum of a socialist redistribution scheme. I would say it's a dialectical evolution of it, and we can debate that at another time because that's not the topic. So you are correct. It's a dialectical inversion. It is a fascism absorbing a communism, roughly, whereas in China you had a communism that's opened up to a fascism within it. And this is literally the goal, is to create this model through the West, literally to create Oceania to compete with East Asia, which it's always been at war with. And that's the nightmare that I'm worried when I look at this and see what these people are actually writing and what they're actually doing and what they're trying to implement.
Now, would this be, like, is Warren part of the Great Reset? For example, the Accountable Capitalism Act, right? This would provide that any company of more than $1 billion needs to obtain a federal charter from a new office that would be created called the Office of Corporations. And it would be obliged to have stakeholder interests, right? That these must be considered. So this is getting away from capitalism. Also, it would forbid directors and corporate officers from selling shares for 5 years. 40% of the board would be elected by employees and prevent corporations making political contributions until they secured 75% of their shareholders, which actually doesn't sound like a bad idea. But is that the idea, to create a new office that would then give you permission, and this is all self-regulated? Is that part of collusion? What do you guys think? Is that
self-regulated? Come on, that's not real. That's going to be simply just acting in the interests of whoever's in control of it. It's that simple.
I agree with that comment for sure.
Whatever bill that you just read, there's no way that passes.
No, it didn't. It didn't. But I'm saying it was proposed.
Okay.
Right,
It didn't pass.
It did not.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Because nobody's going to have boards elected by workers because it's contrary to the interests of the people on the board.
The fact
right?
that it was being proposed, like you would say, like
tons of
can't be a
people propose
conspiracy
all
theory.
sorts of insane legislation all the time. This is like the part of the United States congressional history, right? People do this all the time. I'm pretty sure Ron Paul is out there somewhere drafting another bill to go back to the gold standard still. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff that's being proposed in Congress all the time, right?
Crazy, you say.
What about the digital dollar? An executive order that we must urgently pursue a CBDC. Do you think this is part connected to what Klaus Schwab might want?
Yes, very yes, because a digital dollar sounds great, and you say cool things like, crypto, or they say cool things like blockchain, and it sounds super secure, but they've already explained that they want this digital dollar to be programmable. They want to be able to dictate what you're going to spend. If you remember, we were talking about central planning I got made fun of earlier. They want to be able to dictate what you can spend that digital dollar on. So maybe your digital dollar can only be spent over the next 30 days. So they can implement negative interest rates. Maybe they can say that they're going to will only allow you to spend these dollars on, say, you can only spend $55 a month on meat. And then everybody, after that, it's potatoes for you. When you start talking about programmable dollars, and if you've been to China, I've been to China many times, They can turn off your dollars. You can go to the store and they can tell you, well, you can't spend money today. You can't buy a plane ticket today. You can't buy a train ticket today. You can watch this propaganda video and then you can buy a train ticket. You know, these are the kinds of things that they actually implement in China. When you start messing around with, and with the way they got there, by the way, over the many years I went to China, started out, I used to get my fistful of red money. Like literally it's red, the 100 yuan note is red. And so I had my fistful of these like 100 yuan notes. And then year after year, it was like, well, we can't go to that place. We can't go to that place. We can't go to that place. And it was why? It was because you can only pay with WeChat. You can only pay through the QR code on your app, which is connected directly to the Bank of China, which is now controlled by China, therefore controlled by China's central bank. And that got hooked into their social credit system. And so the way that this ESG stuff for corporations is a social credit system for that, this is easily applicable to individuals eventually when you have a digital dollar. So then they can make sure that you, as an individual, are also going to be compliant with environmental, social, and governance dictates. Again, it's a very small number of people who are going to have control over this, the central bankers. In fact, who did they name to control the U.S. digital dollar? Oh yeah, Larry Fink. The BlackRock CEO, the same guy. How weird it was that guy that they decided to give him this power. So absolutely it is part of this program. It's in fact a necessary component to this program, and it doesn't work without the central bank.
Could you program
digital
a digital dollar to only be spent at a company that had a high enough ESG score?
100% you could. You can program it to do whatever you want it to do.
I mean, you could do that with a debit
this kind
card,
of
too.
dystopia then?
Sounds like an
But you
amazing
cannot do that
plot
with
for
cash.
some like dystopian future movie, but
Well, that's
this
where
is
we're
not going to
headed.
happen. Like,
No.
it's fantastic delusion. I guess it's fun to like circle jerk over the idea that the
Have you
government is
been
going
to
be
China?
dictating.
It's not a delusion.
I'm
It's
not
real.
in China. We live in the United States.
Right, okay, so a lot
we
of
have a
people-
democracy, believe it or not.
No.
Or, well, maybe some people here don't believe it anymore, but yeah, we're not going to have digital programmable dollars in the United States. That's like people
We
like you will
do.
sit up
Our
here.
debit cards are
you,
that.
What?
We have digital programmable dollars. They can shut them off anytime they want. They've shut it off in. They shut Stripe off in
you should talk to some porn
Russia.
stars.
That's not a digital dollar, right?
So
you
there's-
have like
Do you have paper
electronic
money on you?
You have. Sure, I do, but.
They can shut. Well, if you didn't, then let's say. Have you ever had it where you accidentally get your card shut off because you're somewhere that you're not normally?
Because you're
Sure.
a Canadian protester.
I mean, the power is there. The mechanism is
Sure,
there.
but it has nothing to
Or
do with
because you were
digital
the-
dollars,
yeah,
right? Like a
Canadian
bank could
trucker,
deny a
yes.
check
You
or a
gave it
money
the
order, right? But
truckers.
this doesn't have anything to do with digital dollars, or the idea that some digital dollar is going
I
to be
mean, you
created
don't need to
that can
call
only be
it something. You
spent.
just say it's already there. Like you could use the existing mechanism if you really wanted to.
Okay, sure. Well, then let's talk about that. We can use the internet to like do financial transactions. That's a more honest conversation than welcome to Demolition Man, 2022 version. We have digital dollars where the government tells you that you can only spend your dollars at a place where at least 50% of the cups are made of 85% recyclable material.
There's already things like this happening in China. We all acknowledge that they have massive
He's
control.
never been to China. He doesn't
Oh,
know.
true.
He
Doesn't
lives in the
he?
United
China,
States.
do you think that
They have
China's
massive
government is
control over your-
comparable to the United States?
No. We're saying
Do
it's
you think a
not
single
there, but
party
the Great Reset is
totalitarian-
going to take us
It's
there.
not taking
So
us there.
the
We're
average-
fundamentally different styles of
listen.
economy and different styles of governance.
The average American looks at China and they say, holy shit, we never want to be like that, right? That's insane there. But then when the government say, hey, whoa, there's this wacky disease going around, we need to create a policy that tracks everything you do, tells everywhere you go. What people don't realize is we hate China and we look at them and we're like, that's horrible authoritarianism. But the government recognized that while authoritarianism is bad, it's effective. And in order to compete with China, they need some of the same systems. So Australia implemented their vaccine, not even passport, just COVID safe app. Everywhere you go, every minute of the day, you have to track where you are, which store you're going into. That is a lot of data and information that the government have now about your whereabouts 24/7. I don't think they're going to give up that system. I think that system is going to stay in place for a long, long time and be reactivated whenever they need it in order to compete with China.
Sure.
So-
But can't we have like
so-
can't we have a more mature conversation about these systems
How is
rather
that
than
immature?
saying
This is happening.
rather than saying we do this thing, China does a thing that
We
looks
just have a
similar,
different
we're going to
excuse
become
for it.
China.
We have a nicer excuse.
There's no
Better PR.
possible way
Listen,
in this
listen.
world that we can have like these realistic
Steven.
conversations about future policies. If we say that everything, it's like
Steven.
it's like working for a restaurant and your boss
Steven.
is like you have to pull your tips and you're like, oh my God, it's communism now.
Brother,
I think we can have a
listen.
better conversation about what's going on.
Mimigo, listen, have you ever been to a place that's now, because of COVID, unwilling to take cash? Have you been
Yeah.
to one? I was on one yesterday. It's called an airplane. I happen to have, fortunately, a high-level status on the airplane, so they asked me, do you want anything to drink? I was like, yeah, I want a beer. So they give me a beer because I've flown so much, they give me a beer on an airplane as my prize for flying,
Your points.
Yeah, I have so many points. They give me 1 beer on an airplane now. This is what I get. And so the guy sitting next to me was like, I want a vodka cranberry. And the lady comes back with the thing and was like, all right, so it's $5 or whatever, but we just checked, are you so-and-so? And checked the identity, yeah. And he said, well, you don't have a credit card listed on the app, so you can't pay for the alcohol.
This has
So we
nothing
can't give it
to
to
do
you
with the
because
coronavirus.
we've gone completely cashless.
Wait, it's cashlessness came from
Cashlessness
coronavirus.
is, because then
It's
you're
what
stuck
was
on the debit card.
expedited,
I've flown
rather.
a lot too. Lots of airlines were cashless. Delta was cashless before the pandemic.
But
where
it
they
was
won't accept cash.
expedited. This is what the Great Reset is. It is using COVID to expedite a bunch of digital identity, control over our life, tracking of us. It's all expedited through COVID.
So then-
it is stuff that's already happening.
is
We
it-
can witness, we can track, absolutely.
Can we not separate out this weird idea that we're doing it for some authoritarian, shadowy reasons versus there is a lot
I
versus?
think they think. No, I
you
think they
think
think.
so
Oh,
the
sorry,
generation-
I almost finished the sentence. Is it not just possible that as technology evolves and people are looking for convenience in more places, that some things end up
For
getting
sure.
streamlined?
Do you think
They
it's about
think-
convenience
no.
and not about making money?
I think it's both. People want convenience.
I-
How many people like picking up their Google phone and then they click their Google Gmail that goes right to their thing and they can push one button and they can access
No,
all of their cash?
so
and,
I'm sure-
I understand that there is problems with centralizing this much stuff
Yes.
around certain corporations, but you don't need a shadowy government 20
You're right.
people
I
to do
completely
it.
agree.
You just
I
need a
think-
bunch of people that want convenience in their lives that technology.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
call us the law of
Market
convenience.
that
Not
into
to
existence.
think about it
I
every 3
think
days.
the right wing have done themselves a massive disservice by portraying this
Based.
as a conspiracy theory. They talk
Absolutely.
about it like it's all shadowy government. It's not. It's all out in the open. It's all being talked about. Of course, the government and corporations want more power, and of course, a lot of them think they are the good guys. In order to predict black swan events, we have to have control over our society in order to, better outcomes. We need to be able to track everyone so we can do contract tracing. If there's a worse disease that outbreaks, we need to have digital ID. We need to bring in all of these things for the good of the people, right? But then one of the last chapters in Klaus Schwab's book is, what if this becomes a dystopia? And he talks about, this could be abused, this could be misused if it's in the hands of a centralized power. And that is what the problem is. Every villain in every good story thinks they're the good guy.
But you could argue this could happen in either way, right?
Like
Like some people are arguing for more centralization and, oh no, that's horrible. But you could just as easily argue the other side where people are arguing to decentralize things, and that ends up horrible. Look at what happened to... I just realized where I am. Look at what happened with Texas's power grid, right? During the last huge snowstorm shit. They have a unique independent market where you have these different buyers and sellers of energy, and because they're incentivized to only function in a short-term window, their energy market totally fell apart. People were paying $1,000 to heat their home for one night.
Do you know why that happened?
I'm not saying this
Their
to
ESG scores are fucking great because they have windmills.
I'm not saying this. They're probably not.
Pros.
But I'm not saying this to. I'm not saying this to say that free markets are bad or centralized power is good. I'm just saying that you can go too far in either way. We can't just say unilaterally all forms of centralizing anything are always going to be bad when free market stuff can be bad as well. We need to be a little bit more intelligent.
But free
when we
market
analyze
stuff
the
is harder
system.
to abuse.
I disagree with that.
Absolutely is not true.
Corporatism, sure, massive.
I actually think that this is just an acceleration of what we've been on the last 30 years. I don't think that this is something that is new. I don't think that this is something that we need to look at as fundamentally different or a big change. I think it's stuff that we've been seeing accruing over years. And I think that comparing it to China isn't necessarily perfect because I think that a lot of these things came out of the incentivized market as put forward. I don't think that I don't necessarily think that planning is an evil thing. I don't think that it is an issue. But I think the issue here is not so much that it is planning. I think that it is centralized power over the planning.
Whether it be corporations
exactly.
or government.
And I think that that's the direction that corporations have been heading in for decades. And well, it's always been the direction, but that's what the point of them is to get more and profit more.
Yeah, and
Just
I agree
to bolster your point, by the way, Klaus Schwab published his first book in 1971, so 50 years.
But Destiny, why do we need, doesn't shareholder capitalism already account for what you're saying? Why do we need stakeholder capitalism?
Because shareholders don't always represent the interests of the public. There could be really bad
you're
negative
worried about
behavior.
the short-term thing, though. So, but
why would
if Pfizer's making dumb moves to make sure they make their quarterly number, and some other good drug company has been investing some kind of long-term thing, but it's trading as a discount, and then gets huge because everyone was looking for the quarterly profit. Isn't that the solution to the short term? Why do we need ESGs?
Can I ask this question, right? Because you just said shareholders don't represent the interests of the public. So Bill Gates is shareholder of Microsoft. In fact, chief of Microsoft, we'll just say shareholder of Microsoft, doesn't represent the interests of the public, right? But Bill Gates, stakeholder in, say, virus technology, represents the interests of the public all of a sudden. How did that shift occur? How does that work?
Individuals don't represent the interests of the public. They usually represent their own interests.
Well, what would be how? Okay, let's say you need groups of people to be represented in this. How do you get that? How do you get?
It depends on what we're talking about. I mean, unions are one good example of how you have to have collective bargaining ability against like capital,
Sure.
because otherwise an individual worker has no ability to collectively negotiate, right?
Yes. But that's representation. That ultimately puts forward people. And if you have people that are ultimately not necessarily on your side, they're more willing to collaborate with the owners, then you're going to see policies that maybe favor the owners more than the quote-unquote stakeholders in this case. And that's kind of the issue.
Well, I think that's the whole idea or concept of the stakeholder model, is the idea that shareholders don't represent the interests of stakeholders. They just represent the people on the board trying to make money. They're representing the shareholders of the company.
Well, yeah. My argument here, though, is that if they're the ones who are putting forward stakeholder capitalism and they're the ones that ultimately implement it, then the issue is the people who are representing the stakeholders are going to be people who are more likely to be favorable towards the shareholders.
I mean, if that was the case, then we've just recreated our current system with more steps. If
That's
that was
exactly
the case,
what well, that's what I'm arguing.
So I mean, we could say that. That seems like it would be inefficient. Why not? Why wouldn't they just not say anything and continue on with business as usual, though?
Because people are pissed off at business as usual.
Sure. In which
they
case,
want people to say, you're represented here. You're a stakeholder. You're somebody who is feeling a hurt. You're feeling a deficit.
I agree with you, but then that's good. We would want to see something from these businesses that represent.
Yeah, but it's just marketing.
Sure. Well, but then that'll be the question: does anything realistic come out of it, or is it just business as usual? Like, I think people will notice. I don't think people are dumb. They can see what's happening in their day-to-day lives. They see the cost of gas going up. They see houses and apartments, rent skyrocketing. Like, it's not like you can hide it from people. I also
think people will notice, but I think that it takes up time.
Probably, yeah. Everything takes time. Yeah. Apparently, Charles, has been working on this for 50 years, and he still hasn't gotten it accomplished yet. So I guess it's taking a long time for all of this to happen. Yeah.
Like, he hasn't greased the wheels too well, no.
Yeah. If you oppose ESGs, or what would you advise, like a legislator or people to do?
I mean, that's really difficult because this, what in my opinion, and I think again my Marxist friend would largely agree with me on this, is that there has been an insufficient amount of oversight in terms of how index funds were going to be organized. And this has been a creeping problem, at least for 1 or 2 decades, with index funds in specific. And so, legislators, far be it from me to advise legislators in policy, but legislators need to be looking very seriously at what kind of power these index funds can actually exercise over an otherwise freer market. I won't go all the way to say free market, and to start kind of possibly intervening to the point where it could be seen as a form of, racketeering or cartel behavior to organize around a very narrowly defined ESG metric. I wouldn't even care if there were ESG metrics personally, if there was any mechanism by which competition into what defines an ESG score was introduced into the ESG system. If there was 20 different definitions, then maybe we could hash it out and see if it's worth doing. But right now we have a very narrow definition that's controlled by a very small number of interests, which I think that if you start, of course this is executive branch, not legislative branch, but when you start having cartel behavior organizing across corporations, then the legislators can take steps to make certain things that have not been regulated or illegal. They can make those things illegal or bring regulation to them. Executive function, if it weren't also playing along with this game, like I said, the Securities and Exchange Commission has already decided to go along with this, could very easily step in and say, wait a minute, this actually hinders a freer market. This actually is a captured market. This is even, possibly a racketeering-based market, and we're not going to allow that. And we're going to start breaking up some of these big investment firms and spreading that back around, or we're going to get rid of proxy voting or change the rules around proxy voting so that it is the individual shareholders, that I could call up and say, BlackRock, you manage my assets, and here's my opinion, or whatever. Right now, I guarantee you cannot do that. They do not give a crap what you think. and you've actually given over your proxy voting power, which that could be returned. These are ideas that could possibly be brought to bear on this.
Do you want to just should we just get rid of institutional investors, or do people need to go back to buying stocks? Do we outlaw index funds? Because this type of behavior.
I didn't say outlaw them. I said that we should be looking at the way that they can be misused to capture markets and to concentrate power and to regulate around that.
Everything you're saying is still misused. If I have a fund and I'm allocating so much money across different sectors, I would expect these people to be making certain types of demands on behalf of these companies for the fund to perform well. I don't understand. Is your suggestion just that index funds that operate in ways that increase the performance of the index funds by voting accordingly across different corporate boards should be outlawed? I don't understand what the solution is there.
But as we're still going in this, go line up if you want to ask a question.
So I started by saying, far be it from me to advise policy. What I'm saying is that what we have is a situation where people who are actually geared to study this policy should be stepping in and making certain behaviors illegal because they are capturing a market.
What kind of behavior? What do you mean? What is a bad behavior?
Well, here's a bad behavior. Telling people that if they want a satisfactory score to have their company represented by this gigantic program of ESGs, that they have to freaking hire a $1 million a year ESG officer that implements that and only that policy, because only that ESG officer is qualified to dictate what actual ESG policy looks like.
Why wouldn't a fund have the ability to decide who they want to invest in and maybe set some qualifications for that? Different funds invest in all sorts of...
Because they didn't have to bake the cake.
What?
They're a private business. They can do whatever they want. They didn't have to bake the cake.
They can do whatever they want, but if they decide to jump through that hoop to gain that institutional investor, maybe they think that decision isn't something that would be negative for the company. There's tons of capital out there. Jesus, if you go to California, you can get $10 million to fund any crazy random idea that you have.
Try to do it with a bad ESG score. Try to get investment capital with a low ESG score.
I promise you that if you have $1 million or a $10 million idea, an ESG score is not going to get in between you and some angel investor.
Have you talked to any of the people that actually do this?
I lived in these environments, in these tech worlds, in these gaming worlds where there's all sorts of money. I know that all of you know this, okay? Or maybe you don't, but there are so many millions of dollars.
You're talking about a very small group of people.
But that would change your mind if people started
trillions.
losing loans because the ESG score is too low.
We don't get to have the intelligent conversation because it's some weird conspiratorial thing. Okay. We can have
What's the conspiracy?
Well, then let's ask.
The conspiracy is the idea
let's take the first question.
That there is some company that's forcing ESG scores onto people in order to have more black, trans, environmentally friendly employees or something, right? When the reality is that large institutional investors that have shares across lots of companies are probably going to be incentivizing those companies to act in ways that synergize with their funds. But this is what you would expect any institutional investor to do. If I own 2 companies and I have a 50% stake in both, I'm going to be making sure that these companies are synergizing well with each other. That would be the expectation. Now, if we want to be opposed to institutional investing, that's a separate conversation, but I don't think anybody wants to take the step to say that we shouldn't be able to buy index funds or ETFs anymore, because now you're talking about radically reshaping U.S. capital markets.
You're a very dichotomous thinker. It's either we have them or we don't. No, I literally said we step in and
the problem is because when you say we don't, we need to step in and change the behaviors. What is the behavior?
These are our
man.
Maybe I can
our stakeholders.
Maybe I can rephrase this a little.
I see stakeholders.
Maybe I can rephrase this a little differently. How are these ESG scores enforced without a government or some people with force behind them? It sounds like you're saying that they would be leveraging their investments or their lending to do this, but why wouldn't that be subject to market forces, same as any other product on the market?
Because they're the market. They control roughly 40 to 50% of the market. And when you have that much of a reservoir of control of the market, they become de facto the market. And so if you want to play with the biggest guy if you don't want to go with some small bank that may or may not fail, but you want to go with the big giant invincible thing that has $12 trillion in its asset pool, well, you've got to play by the $12 trillion asset pool guy's rules. That's literally how it works. Me and the Marxists, we could get up and hug over this.
Yeah, I really am liking hearing this.
It's 100% what's happening.
There is so much foreign capital. There's so much domestic capital. The idea that you would
foreign capital has none of the aligning interests? Do you think there's
everybody has interest? That's why it's called capital. Yeah, of course, there's always going to be interest in a loan that you take. But the idea that one player, the idea I pissed off the dude at BlackRock, my ESG score is an F, I'm so screwed. I have this multi-billion-dollar idea and now I can't pursue it because BlackRock hates me. It's just delusional. It shows a total misunderstanding of how all capital markets work.
You ever been blacklisted from anything?
Well, as somebody that's currently banned on like at least 3 social media platforms, yeah, I would say that I have been, yeah.
Well, what can you do on those social media platforms now?
Having a right to a social media platform is different than having
You're not
access to
talking about
capital.
social media. I'm making an analogy here, sir.
Okay, what can I?
What
nothing.
can you do there?
Nothing?
Yes, correct. That's all. You can't do anything.
When you-
if these big companies blacklist you,
A BlackRock
and,
dollar is not different than a dollar from another domestic
and you
Yes,
don't
investor
think
but
or
they've
another
got-
foreign
has
investor.
influence over other companies?
Yes.
You don't think they
No,
have
you think
connections
that you
in
think
other
that
companies?
you think that BlackRock is going to tell other institutional investors you're not allowed to invest in that highly profitable thing. because
You
you're gonna
really
hurt our
think
index
that
fund."
doesn't happen?
No, it absolutely doesn't.
All right,
If
fine.
that was the case, then we
No,
wouldn't be
no,
up
we're
here
fine.
talking about how like, oh my God, like Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon are controlling the economy by making us go to war. If that was the case, every other large company, right? The market capitalization of all these companies combined is like half of Apple's market capitalization. If that was the case that these private companies could control so much of the other parts of the economy, we would never go to war, for instance, right? Because
Do you think us saying we shouldn't go to war has any effect on us going into war?
But building weapons.
It doesn't
raises
matter
our
what we
score.
say in that case.
Building iPhones is more profitable than building weapons. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
is
sorry,
it?
but it is.
Is
Like,
it?
you can look, you can go and look. It's all publicly available information.
Like my name on Twitter right now is B2 Spirit, which refers to a bomber that cost $2 billion a pop to build, and it costs like $80 billion to design. Like, are iPhones more profitable?
$80 billion over what time frame? Because Apple as a company is worth like $2 trillion. So when you're talking about like an $80 billion project over 10 years, like, no, I don't think that these are the people that are controlling the levers of the economy.
All right, let's take the next one.
Imagine if you put 1,000 of them together. By the way, I'm going to be that guy before we take the next one. Sorry, Brian, I'm going to override your authority here. ESG scores are not graded A through F, since you're talking a lot about them. They're scored 1 through 5, and 1 is the best score, 5 is the worst.
I know James Lindsay already told me this, but this is for Lauren Southern. In the concept, and it's due to the fact that you tend to be against globalism. In the concept of global village, as described by Marshall McLuhan, do you think globalization is inevitable due to technology and the fact that the whole world's being connected through technology, and there's somewhat of a cultural exchange?
Yeah, of course, I do think globalization is inevitable, but I also think it's being sped up by corporate interests.
Hi. So I was wondering how you see this this takeover happening. Thanks. Takeover happening in third world countries that are much more cash-based. I now live in Baja for this very reason, and I'm wondering how long I've got.
Okay, I got to take this one. It's very funny to me that I see a lot of my friends who would be considered these like right-wing radicals against immigrants, against all these different countries, and they're like, nah, I love immigration. I'm headed to Mexico right now because they don't have vaccine passports, they don't have digital ID, I can pay cash with everything. You'll actually find,
Socialized healthcare, too. They got that down there.
well, on a surface level, a lot of, I guess we don't use the word third world country anymore.
The
but
global south.
The global south, a lot of developing countries, we may characterize them as less free than the Western world. In reality, because there's just not the same ability to enforce a lot of these policies, they tend to be more free on a day-to-day basis. So I find that to be an interesting...
So I'll give you an example that's a little counterintuitive, but it's true, and a lot of people don't realize this, and it ties into the COOF. So one of the industries that probably got hit the hardest with like a COVID-19 cruise missile that you probably thought, yeah, good, because those things are petri dishes for diseases, not for canine rape culture. It's a different story. Is the cruise industry. So you shut down the cruise industry, and it's massively shut down. It's kind of open now, but everybody's getting the virus. They all have to be vaccinated, but they get it anyway. It's really weird. But
It's part of the cruise.
yeah,
part of the package
it's part of
you
the
buy it.
experience. Yeah, that's right. And so the cruise industry got shut down like harder than almost any other travel-based, tourism-based industry, period. And you think, okay, good, because those boats are dangerous in terms of disease transmission. But what that brought, before it got shut down, was about 5 Super Bowls worth of economic activity to poor third world, if we want, countries in the Caribbean that now have their entire economy, which was travel and tourism largely driven by cruise ships, completely shut down. But then, partnered with the World Economic Forum, you have this other entity called the International Monetary Fund, which controls at least $1.5 trillion in assets plus ties to these central banks. And they step in and they say, you know what, your economy has been destroyed by COVID-19. Let us help you build a new infrastructure for a new world and a new economy, and let us help you build a digital infrastructure to put you on a digital currency that we'll set you independently. You can be more involved in the world market, et cetera. And that's how they implement it in these smaller countries. That's a real world example of something that actually has happened. And by the way, China is competing with the IMF there because in addition to being able to build infrastructure for CBD, Cs or whatever it is, you also have the ability to control shipping lanes through the Caribbean waters. And so China and the International Monetary Fund have both openly been competing to take over the control and the governance of Caribbean islands that were shut down, and their economies were shut down because of the cruise industry being shut down because of COVID, because it's used as a narrow window of opportunity to effect a great reset of the economies of the world into a new model that's based on stakeholders.
And the South Pacific, too.
Yeah, everywhere that the cruise industry is the dominant force of the economy, that's what's happened. And so what you'll see, broadly speaking, is that if the so-called first world or the developed world goes onto this program, try to tell me what resistance Brazil is going to mount against that, or what resistance Mexico, I mean, it's their drug cartel is the only resistance that is going to mount. And the way is that you beat the big countries, and then the small countries are stuck and get dragged along. This is why the Davos has openly said, if we don't get the UK and we don't get the United States, then this probably isn't going to work.
Do you think that's rigging the system? Do you think this is like some...
I think that the world is naturally progressing towards like a more technologically unified entity, but that's that's the natural consequence of how technology works.
So let me state, by the way, that I agree with that. And I also agree that with what Lauren said a minute ago, that we are going to a more global community. We are going to get increasingly digital. I believe strongly in the law of convenience, which is that whatever's most convenient is what people will gravitate to. And I don't want that to be under the control of a small number of plutocrats. I want that to be as decentralized as possible.
But how does that happen
when the whole
when
essence of my argument?
There's only one way to do that, though. And the only person that would have a solution to that up here would be Peter, which would be to have the government control all of it. Because any free market is naturally going to tend towards just one or two major players. That's just how it works.
I mean, we beat monopolies kind of 100 years ago. We can
using the government to split these companies up, but
well, that's fine. I think the word regulations come out of my mouth like 7 times.
Sure.
There's a lot of decentralized technologies being floated, but they just aren't being floated by these entities like the World Economic Forum.
Because nobody likes decentralized stuff. Somebody wants to
certainly not powerful people.
No, certainly not you people. Like, everybody is making this happen, right? People want to turn on their computer and see the photograph that they took on their phone, like, instantly pop up in their email address. Like, we're all a slave to convenience.
You can model that in a decentralized way, that sort of
How?
technology.
No,
it's just not being widely adopted because it is certainly not the stuff being promoted by those in power right now.
I don't agree. I think people like the centralization. Nobody likes to have to remember a different password for every device. If people want to be able to use one thing to log in to like all the things, like consumers have made these choices over and over and over again. These are like basic principles of design.
I gotta admire this guy's patience here. So we're going to take the next question.
Okay, I'm a very patient man. I just make a couple quick comments, and then I'll ask for some commentary on my comments here. This was the most fascinating panel this evening, simply because I never knew what to expect out of everyone's mouth. It's particularly, I did not expect the majority of Destiny's time to be defending capitalist investments in a free market perspective compared to the rest of the panel. So my takeaway from all of this, it seems to me that if we simply combined everyone's perspective together, we would kind of get an accurate picture of what's actually going on. It's kind of the blind men describing the elephant here. From a free market perspective, as an investment company, you have to provide profit or else you're going to fail. However, the people running these companies are human beings, and there's no such thing as an unbiased human. We all have our own agenda. So the more powerful you are, the more money you have, the more in which you're going to try to push your agenda forward. So, of course, you have your free market principles. So at the very end of the day, my question here, though, is that if we simply combine the ideas that we do have these free market principles, and the companies do have to form a profit, but they are run by individuals who do have their own biases. It's an interplay between the two of these, and I think if we kind of understand this as a full continuum, you think maybe we can kind of come to an agreement that it's not just a conspiracy and it's not just profitability, it's an entire interplay of all of these principles.
I would agree 100% with that. I mean, there are going to be people that you can't deny that corporate culture exists. You can't deny that there's going to be some ideological bias on the part of a major institutional investor. That's absolutely possible. But they don't push alone. It's a push and pull constantly with where society is at, where the investors are at, where the government is at. And you mentioned earlier that I'm up here defending capitalism. I'm just trying to explain how it works. I am a big believer in government intervention in a lot of these cases. And I think now the Republicans, I guess, got banned enough from Facebook that they're believers in government intervention too in some of these private platforms. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize, like, how are these institutions going to function in the world realistically? So we need to have real descriptions, and we need to make real predictions, not saying crazy stuff like Disney is going to go bankrupt in 5 years, right? We need to have a good understanding of how this works. And then once we have that understanding, we can design government policy to enact it in a way that it represents the interests of the people. Ironically, in a stakeholder sense, I guess.
I fucking didn't say that.
Go ahead.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but James, how do you think that ESG affects the pillars of culture, for instance, education, and specifically free area and education, and how does that tie into sort of what it may look like 10 or 20 years from now, and how will it promulgate? For instance, you have Amazon HQ2 opening, and they're actually funding a high school there. So what is that going to look like going forward?
I mean, so the goal really, there's two sides to the question that you're asking. One is, how are they implementing kind of the ESG thing into education? And the goal is actually to implement ESG into education. It's to teach kids to buy into the ESG program so that the ESG metrics will maybe work. This is the sustainable and resilient future, an inclusive future that they openly say is the goal that they're trying to build. So there's that aspect. But the more interesting question is how and why is this happening? And the answer is because the one thing we didn't actually mention specifically that these gigantic investment firms control are pension funds. In fact, they control all your pensions. That's, in fact, what they're using is your pension, especially if you're on in a public servant role. If you're a teacher, they're using your pensions in order to make decisions based on how they're going to reorder capitalism. That, in fact, is the gigantic pot of gold that they openly said that they were chasing 15 years ago. And so how are they pulling schools around? Well, besides the fact that, you know, they do have a cult of fealty to this DEI stuff that's really spread, especially through the education sector, but they're also controlling education sectors.
In what way? Are they donating through NGOs?
Do you want your pension fund to be able to be listed within these these allegedly highly profitable portfolios, or do you want them tanked? It's that simple.
Well, I mean, what are pension funds going to be a part of? Do you want them buying treasury bonds? Do you want a 1% to 2% return on your pension fund that doesn't even outpace inflation? Like,
no, I just don't want a small group of plutocrats deciding what the shape of the market is going to be as they structure the market for themselves. That's literally the only thing that I want, or don't want, I suppose.
I don't know what your understanding is for how these markets function. Do you think that pension funds should only be like you buy individual stocks then? You just don't invest in ETFs or index or what?
No, I said like 11 times before.
You said nothing. You keep saying nothing is the problem. Lawmakers should do something to get rid of bad behavior.
Okay. When I say, for example, ideas like that perhaps it should be considered racketeering, which is a fucking felony, to organize all investment under ESG, I am not saying nothing. I am not saying nothing.
So do you think that an institutional
I'm sorry
investor,
you don't understand the words I'm using because you've read zero of the books.
No, it's not about the books. It's just having a basic understanding of finance
that
everybody is painfully unaware of. Because they'll come on stage and they'll confidently say things like, institutional investors are going to tank their entire portfolios because of something that some guy said in a book that I read. Like, that's just not how any of it works. That's why you can't point to any of these examples happening. That's why you're saying crazy. That's exactly what you're saying. So the question then becomes, and I know it's uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I don't mean to push on specifics because finance is hard. I understand. But my question is do you think that we should have these rules that institutional investors can't have any qualifications for the funds that they include in their portfolios? Should that be made illegal to you? Because that's what you're saying.
No,
you're saying that it's racketeering.
I think racketeering should be illegal. That's it.
So racketeering for you is an institutional investor saying, we're only going to invest in these types of companies. That's racketeering to you. They shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Part of the problem is having rules that...
No, don't bail them out. I want to hear the...
No, I'm not bailing
I say
them out.
fucking nothing. I say nothing.
I know you do. I know it's
I'm as done with you as I can be. Better Discourse is over for me. I'm done.
No, and this is how I feel when people talk about finance and they don't understand how any of the
I think he's talking more about bid rigging and inclusion.
No, the problem is that...
Why don't we just...
You spend so much time getting mad about people misrepresenting your arguments, and they do, and you just said he wants people to tank their whole portfolio based on a book one guy read. When did he argue that?
The idea that these institutional investors are going to be implementing these things for these corporations, for these firms that run contrary to the interests of the shareholders themselves because they're trying to jump through some ESG hoop.
Not will be, are, have been, current, present tense, not future.
If it was the case that that was happening, then other capital would come in and would start. Do you just not believe in capital
with
markets?
Elon's bid in Twitter, other capital came in, and then what happened? They started filing SEC violations against them out of the woodwork.
Poison pilled. Welcome to corporate finance. This stuff happens all the time. Like, there are all sorts of schemes like this. There are huge short squeezes have happened historically where companies have owned a large amount of like the portfolio of another company through subsidiaries and stuff. This is Capital 101. It's not a new thing that's happening now because of ESG. That's just how capital markets are. They're rough. They're dirty.
Well, that's some agreement that there can be some bad shit going on. Next question.
Howdy, y'all.
Yes.
So first and foremost, I just want to say that the conversation happening on this stage is probably one of the most important. That should be this should be being had everywhere. And Destiny, I know it's hard to believe. I remember watching the old Glenn Beck segment, The Puppet Master, with George Soros, like a long time ago. And as silly as it was, it got me interested. And I ended up reading 2 of Soros's books, Alchemy of Finance. That was the main one that struck me. I read about Black Tuesday in '92, where he shorted the British pound and pretty much tanked the UK economy, decimated their currency, ruined the housing market, caused a lot of damage. They were actually kicked out of the European exchange rate mechanism. So my question is, with everything going on, there are established cryptocurrencies right now that are decentralized ledgers. Do those pose a threat to the World Economic Forum agenda? And if they do, what actions will the WEF take against crypto holders right now? Could they potentially use something like the IRS to target crypto holders like the IRS targeted the Tea Party?
The last thing any crypto holder needs to worry about is the IRS, because they're only going to tax you on your gains, and 95% of people that mess with crypto lose all their money. So I don't think they have to worry about the IRS. Number one, I don't think crypto represents any threat to any type of like central banking or currency right now. That might change in the future, but I don't see that being the case right now.
A lot would have to change.
Sure, they're not real currencies right now. They're speculation vehicles that people are using to try to out-speculate fuck the other person is essentially what all cryptocurrency is right now.
The thing that would be a threat would be people all actually organizing around specific means to like hold up labor, to hold up the actual markets, to actually interrupt these processes. That would be the threat.
The problem is when people actually want to use their crypto, for the most part, they have to take it out into cash, and the government controls, certainly in Canada anyways, all the trades, and you have to put your ID in, get taxed on it, so it doesn't really, yeah.
In the executive order that Biden said, looking into the CBDCs, it does specifically say that cryptocurrency is going to be investigated for certain frauds.
I mean, I think if anybody that's followed crypto knows, it's probably a good thing. There have been like a ton of huge, like they call them rug pulls. This is a whole other topic, but there is a lot of fraud that goes on. I say fraud, but like that goes on in cryptocurrencies where people are just basically screwing over like huge sections of investors with bogus white papers or with just crazy ideas that, you basically pay a bunch of influencers to back your idea and they sell all of their stuff on day one to like screw over it. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to start to regulate these, or at least look at these a little bit more closely, because they're hyper fucked right now.
So you're saying that if there were regulations on the behavior of the crypto markets, it would be a good thing?
Yeah, I'm a sock them, so yeah, I would say that, absolutely.
Okay. Well, isn't that what he said about the main markets?
Interesting.
I'm not talking about there being no regulation on the main markets. That wasn't what we were talking about.
Well, what I'm saying, it's not necessarily that the crypto market is a one-to-one representation of the main markets, but it is something that can show us what happens when you're further away from regulation. Now,
yeah, but the problem with the crypto markets is like the stuff that you can do in crypto markets would get you shit-canned immediately by the SEC. You can't do stuff with conventional markets like you can with crypto markets. So that regulation, I would say, is probably a good thing.
I would agree.
Yeah,
At least in our current situation.
When the great crypto reset shows up, then Destiny will be a believer. So, Mikey, you coming out? Do you have one?
Yeah, they're coming and telling me to give you the hook.
I'm
I
getting
think
the
they
hook.
want you to shut up or something. Do you guys want them to shut up? That was kind of mixed, I think. I can't tell.
It's just me. They want me to shut up.
No, they
Should,
don't.
shall I alert people to stuff? I think I'm supposed to give you guys the hook.
That one person did say that, yes.
We have to listen to her.
All right.
They
we are
they
taking
like
the hook.
tapped
You want
me
to
on
close
the
it up?
ass and
We're
pushed
leaving.
me out here. I don't know what I'm.